Here they are. Dig. Yes. I guess we're starting, are we?
Are you on yet? Turn it on. Let me see.
It's,
Oh, it's on. Okay, let me do a little spill first and then you can go. Okay, welcome everybody. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. People on Zoom, you are muted. Please stay muted. If you have questions, put it in the chat after the presentation and we can ask the speaker. People in the room, if you have a cell phone, you can please turn it down. Greatly appreciate that. So Rick is not here, so he's not going to introduce the speaker, but this is Richard McMaster, and he's going to talk to you today, right, Richard?
hey, what?
You're going to talk to them today.
Yes, I think so.
Have at it. There you go.
If I wake up. Yes. Right. Well, thank you. And we have a celebrity guest today, my son Tom and my granddaughter Maya, who are visiting from Atlanta. So, all right, let's go to the, well, that's all right. Let's go to the first one there, if you would. We'll just hold it on that. All right. In 1763, the 7 Years' War came to an end in Europe, and in North America, it had a tremendous impact. The French colonial empire that had stretched from Nova Scotia in a great arc across the whole continent to New Orleans was now reduced to two small islands between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, Saint Pierre and Miquelon, Little Michael. Everything else had fallen into British hands. So it was by the Treaty of Paris, it was a great victory for Britain, and at the same time, it had been an expensive war, and it was also a very expensive responsibility. Late in the war, the Spaniards had stepped in to aid their Bourbon colleagues in France, and Britain in 1760 had occupied Havana and held Cuba. And in the treaty in 1763, they gave Cuba back to Spain, and in exchange, Spain gave them the territories of East Florida and West Florida stretching to the French line at the Mississippi. So it was across Alabama, Mississippi, Alabama, and the present state of Florida. And so this vast new empire needed a new way of looking at colonial rule. And that was included in the Proclamation of 1763, a very, very important, very interesting document. When I was in school, if we said anything about it, it was, well, you know, it closed the frontier with a line that ran from the heads of all the rivers that flowed into the Atlantic. And if you drew a line from one to the other, you had the border of the American colonies and the border of an area they were not to go into. But it was much more than that. There's a question among historians at various times, was this promoting or protecting, rather, indigenous people? Or was it simply confining the colonists? Well, let's look at the document itself next. All right. It closed the frontier, yes. It created new colonies. There was a new colony in covering much of Canada called Quebec. There was a new colony in which we are living called East Florida, and another one called West Florida. There were two other minor additions to the North American colonies. One was, I just went blank for heaven's sake. I'm trying to think what I was about to say something and I can't think what it was. I'm sure you never have that problem. So anyway, uh, new colonies, and but that was just part of it. The most significant part of this proclamation is one that really I had never thought much about, and that was the remarkable statement that beyond that frontier line, the indigenous peoples owned their land. And if you happen to look at the title to your property in Florida, or as a matter of fact, almost anywhere in the United States, you will see that the title runs all the way back, not to the Creek Indians or the Seminoles. It runs all the way back to the King of England or to the King of Spain. And that was upheld in 1835 by the United States Supreme Court in a case involving the Arredondo Grant. And I'm not absolutely certain whether Okamic is on part of that grant, but much of Alachua County is part of that Arredondo Grant. It was a grant made just before the King of Spain sold Florida to the United States in 1817, and he made a grant to a wealthy Cuban businessman who was a supporter of the crown named Arredondo. And the Supreme Court upheld that, and subsequent Supreme Court decisions have said, quite bluntly, that indigenous people never owned the land. They were like squirrels and rabbits. They just happened to inhabit it. And it all belonged to some European monarch. So the importance of this was so significant that it has been embodied word for word in the Canadian Constitution, and declaring that in Canada they're called the First Nations. The First Nations actually own their land, and that was part of this proclamation of 1763. The next important part is really just a corollary of that, and that is that private land purchases are outlawed. Traditionally, all through the American colonies, people managed to get some sachem or leading man of a tribe, give him a few trinkets, maybe get him drunk on rum, and have him scratch a mark on a piece of paper that said he just sold some incredibly vast tract that he did not really control. Well, that was now outlawed. You couldn't do that. And only the king can make treaties and purchase land. So you moved Indian relations in the matter of ceding land into being solely a government operation, no more private enterprise. And in addition to that, it's important to know that huge numbers of small and very large uh, Indian purchases have been being made, and many of them under very dubious circumstances over the years, and many individuals were deeply involved in this kind of operation. Let's have the next one. The Ohio Company of Virginia was one of the oldest. It was formed in 1752 with the idea that they would obtain a very large grant in what would be essentially part of West Virginia and Ohio today. George Mason of Gunston Hall, who was a very significant man in the political rise of the move toward independence, was the treasurer from 1752 to 1792. And the other shareholders in the Ohio Company were a register of all of the really, really prominent people in Virginia. So this was a significant block of potential Revolutionary War patriots. The Greenbrier Company picked up a smaller area in what would be West Virginia now, and the Loyal Land Company had an area in what would be part of Western Pennsylvania. And all of these were first family of Virginia operations looking to make a vast profit. The in fact, just you may well remember some of this, but the Ohio Company sent out a expedition to build a fort at the forks of the Ohio at the site of what's now Pittsburgh, and they gave the command of the group who were going to go out and do that to George Washington. And Washington failed to reach the forks of the Ohio before the French arrived, and they were beginning to build Fort Duquesne there. And then in 1753, Washington had a skirmish with the French. One Frenchman was killed, and that was really the beginning of the French and Indian War, which started before the 7 Years' War and would continue, actually, not with the French, but with the Indians into 1766 with the Pontiac Rebellion. So, very important that we remember these land companies and their interest. They wanted private enterprise in the new territories, okay? The suffering traders were a group of individuals, almost all of them Pennsylvanians, who had been involved in sending trade goods out to the Indians, some of them very big operations, some of them quite small. And when the French and Indian War broke out, they lost all of their trade goods. The French or the Indians simply seized them, and in most cases, the actual traders were allowed to go back to Pennsylvania. They are a very interesting group. The Whartons were one of the big ones. William Trent was another, and there were also much smaller traders, the Lowry family, Joseph Simon and his son-in-law Andrew, not Andrew, but Levy, Andrew Levy from Lancaster. These people had a grudge against the government that they hadn't provided safety for them and so on. And so they had filed a petition in right after 1763, and they sent Ben Franklin as their agent to go over and see if he could get the suffering traders recompensed with a grant of land. That dragged on for a while. Franklin, at that point, was very much on the make, looking for jobs for his son William, and one of them was to be the collector for the Stamp Act in Pennsylvania. In Ben Franklin's mind at that point, there was nothing wrong with the Stamp Act. And then he was quite shocked when he realized the amount of opposition there was at home. Well, the next stage of this was the suffering traders were bought out by some of them, the Wharton and Trent particularly, as the Indiana Company. The Indiana Company wanted to have a new colony. If you could create East Florida and West Florida, why couldn't you create Indiana? And Indiana would have been essentially the state of West Virginia. And again, Ben Franklin was sent over along with Samuel Wharton as their agents in London. And they decided the best way, I'm sure this was Franklin's thought, the best way to get something through Parliament was to get some prominent members of Parliament into the company. So they brought in a man named Thomas Walpole, who was part of a very influential political family in England. And this company was sometimes called the Walpole Company. They put him at the head. And this negotiation went on for a long time. They decided after many negotiations that they would ask for a new colony to be set up, again, more or less the state of West Virginia, to be called Vandalia. And that was an odd comment that they were paying tribute to King George and his wife, Queen Charlotte, because she was allegedly a descendant of the Vandals, one of the tribes who came into the Roman Empire. And oddly enough, after long negotiations in 1771, Parliament favored, yes, we will create this new colony of Vandalia, and you will be the people responsible for it. But like everything, it took in any government, it took a long time to implement. It was 1773 before we had come to Britain say, yes, we are working out a map now. This is what the territory will include. This is the kind of royal government you will have, and so on. And by 1773, we've reached the Boston Tea Party, and Parliament was no longer much interested in paying attention to the land claims of a bunch of Americans. So Vandalia never came into existence. And the interesting thing is that of all the investors in all these companies, all these very, very prominent people. No one of them ever made a penny. The only people who made any profit out of this whole thing were those small fry in the suffering traders who had sold their rights to one of these people who thought, well, we could just get a grant in England and so on. And so they made some money out of it. Nobody else did. Okay. Now, settler violence. One of the efforts of, one of the efforts of the proclamation or effects of the proclamation of 1763 was to organize relations with the Indians. And Sir William Johnson in the Mohawk Valley of New York was made the overall agent to deal with all the North American tribes. And he had a deputy named John Stewart in Charleston, South Carolina, who was dealing primarily with the southern tribes. And they were attempting to see that the rights of the native peoples were not violated by settlers coming in and often offering violence of one kind or another. Well, we now get into the second area here, which is settler violence. Settler violence is endemic all over the place, all through history. It's not limited to North America, where you have disputed land between the indigenous people, whoever they may be, and other people who are moving in and say, well, we have the right here, you don't. And it's there that you have violence on both sides. And flowing into that everywhere again, whether you're in the Balkans or almost anywhere in in North America, is the inherent racism in the colonial enterprise, that you assume that the indigenous people are, because they are not blonde, blue-eyed Englishmen or whatever, that they must be inferior people who would be better off just moved out. And in the whole history of the United States was run quite along that line. So let's get the next one. All right. And so then the other element in settler violence along the Proclamation line of 1763 was the belief that the other people pose a clear threat to you, that they are a danger, that all of them are a danger. And so we have, and after all, remember, the whole French and Indian War had been a war of small atrocities, that an isolated family would be massacred, and then the Indian war party dragged them out to the bodies out to a crossroads as a sign, so they'd be seen and recognized as, yes, you people should leave us alone and go back wherever you came from. But this, so there were real grievances among the frontier settlers about the Indians, as there were grievances among the Indians about the frontier settlers. In 1763, the winter of 1763, in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, along the Susquehanna River, there was a town or village of native Indians, native people, who had been living there forever and who they made baskets and they peddled stuff around. They worked for people and, they had not caused any harm. But the settlers in Haxton Township, which would be Harrisburg, Virginia, and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, is the most notable place there, and some from Lancaster, uh, rode out on a December morning and killed everybody in this Indian village. Their argument was men, women, and children. Their argument was that they were in league with some of the French connected Indians who had committed atrocities in the previous few years. So we have to eliminate them. And the second example that was developed by Patrick Sparrow in a couple of interesting books of the stories of the black boys who were the other side of the river in Cumberland County, west of the Susquehanna. These people were concerned not so much with killing Indians as they were with preventing traders from carrying goods to Indians beyond the frontier line out toward Illinois, all through the Midwest. Traders went way out to the Mississippi. And one of the things that the Indians wanted was rifles for hunting. And the black boys were convinced that the Indians wanted these rifles in order to kill settlers. So the black boys interfered with a major, in fact, it was a Wharton pack horse trade going out with trade goods, and had a pitched battle with them and destroyed all of the trade goods that they were sending, and they defied the British soldiers who were part of the Black Watch, the Highlanders, and who were set out to quell this. So this is in 1765. There was a kind of a rebellion out there. All right, now, I labeled this as Frontier Grievances. There's a brand new book out by a man named Colin Calloway, a very good historian, primarily of Indian affairs, who it's called Hard Neighbors. And his argument is that all through American history, it was the Scotch-Irish who were determined to kill Indians at whatever price. Now, when I saw that, I thought, I think you're a bit exaggerating. I mean, I did a book on the Scotch-Irish, and I was the president of the Scotch-Irish Society of the USA at one time, and spent an awful lot of time in Ulster. And it seemed to me that this is sort of like saying, well, all of the crime in America, oh, that's Mexicans coming across the border. Well, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. But that kind of idea is around. And it hides the fact that there were real grievances behind the Paxton boys and the black boys and all the rest of them. When the Paxton boys decided to take their case to Philadelphia, to this colonial government, they had a march on Philadelphia in 1764, and they brought a document with them with listing the grievances of the frontier. And one of the most significant grievances there was that the government, the elected assembly in Pennsylvania, was hopelessly weighted in favor of the older counties along the Delaware and against the new settlements to the west. So what they were asking was a reorganization of some of these very big, unwieldy western counties, and consequently more members for the actual settlers in the toward the frontier in the backcountry to not simply be dominated by the people in Philadelphia and the immediate counties around there. And the black boys had very much the same concern, that they were not really represented in the government, that they were treated as though they were some kind of second class citizen. Let's get the next one. Now, that was personified by the Paxton March in Philadelphia in 1764. In North Carolina, there began a movement called the Regulators. North Carolina had been filling up with, because of very heavy 18th century immigration, had been filling up with largely Scotch-Irish and also German settlers moving down the Great Wagon Road through Virginia, settling in many parts of Western Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley and so on, and moving on to North Carolina, and eventually South Carolina, although there's also settlement fed in from Charleston, and even more than in uh, in Pennsylvania, the backcountry counties were huge and unwieldy. And the regulator movement began initially because there was no one really to enforce the law. And it made me think, if the nearest policeman was in Ocala and the only law court was in Tallahassee, it would be probably, you'd worry about the protection of your property here in Alachua. And this was the kind of distance that North Carolina people dealt with. So they were asking immediately either to do something about this, or they were forming regulators who really were kind of vigilante groups, that they would enforce the law. And in 1766, when this was still somewhat inchoate, the sheriff of one of these very large, unwieldy counties began laying taxes and imposing taxes that the people thought were not actually legal. So they had riots and people were arrested for interfering with the government, and the South Carolina regulation, North Carolina regulation, was well on its way in 1766. A little bit later, the South Carolina regulators followed the same thing, and a lot of it was cattle raiding. That the main export from these far distant farming communities was small black cattle who were driven all the way way from Piedmont, South Carolina, to Philadelphia to market, and they found that there were people raiding them and stealing cattle and so on, and that they were not protected. So there was a great deal of hostility all through the backcountry. And in that same period, down into East Florida, there were the people called crackers. And Florida crackers, according to Charleston newspapers in the 1760s, were in fact gangs of cattle thieves. They were not, wasn't anything you ought to be called. You didn't want to be called a Florida cracker. In 1760s, you were a criminal here. So, at any rate, the problems in North Carolina expanded into one last movement by the regulators. They were objecting to unfair taxes. They had been, many of their leaders had been rounded up and arrested. And so, very much like the Paxton March on Philadelphia, they moved, led largely by a man named Herman Husband. They moved on the Capitol at Newbern in Tidewater, and they were opposed by the royal governor, William Tryon, who insisted that they were all criminals and they should all be rounded up and arrested. And he called out the coastal militia. And Tryon advanced with his little army on the center of where the regulators were encamped. And they had a full-blown battle in 1771. Numbers of people killed on both sides, many prisoners taken on both sides, and it was an all-out victory for the regulators. And that was perhaps, it's one of those many things that are claimed as the first battle of the American Revolution, that North Carolinians had stood up against a royal governor, against his decrees, and ended it with a victory. And with that happy thought, I will end and give you the victory of no longer having to listen to me. All right. So have we got some questions?
Questions? Anybody got any questions for Richard? No, yeah, I stopped the share. Let's get this off my screen. No questions from Zoomers. Anybody out in the room have a question? You do? Okay.
Is it true that the Florida crackers got their name from the cracking of whips?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. Yes, yes, that's the story.
Any other question?
Because they were cattle. They were driving cattle. You've got one back there.
Yeah, you've been talking about the southern colonies. Was there much relationship with the northern colonies? Was there? Did they have common interests? And for example, Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and so on. Was there a lot of connection with North Carolina and in South Carolina?
not sure I heard everything. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, I was thinking about, the colonies from Massachusetts in the north, all the way down through Virginia and the Carolinas. Was there much common interest among the northern colonies and the southern colonies? And where they, I guess, what did they have common causes and where?
Much mutual interest among the colonies?
Yeah.
I'm kind of deaf, which is a problem here.
Okay. Yeah, particularly the problem of, yeah, at least we think of the northern colonies, Massachusetts, having a certain history, and yeah, you've been talking about the
Yes.
southern colonies.
Yes.
I'm asking, what was there any commonality among those two groups?
Yeah. Well, the frontier line didn't really affect New England that much. So Massachusetts Bay, which then included Maine, was pretty quiet on those lines. But everywhere you were beginning to have an objection to the royal or the proprietary governor. I was going to say earlier, and it slipped my mind, was that Franklin was in London in 1765 because Pennsylvania was petitioning to be a royal colony, which seems odd, but it was because the Penn family had arranged that no property that they owned could be assessed at a higher rate than the most worthless piece of property in the most inaccessible place. So it was manifestly unfair, but it was like, if you owned a beachfront hotel in Miami Beach, you can't be charged any more than I would be because I own a half an acre of swamp somewhere between here and Monticello, Florida. So there was a great deal of resentment on that also, that kind of thing, and that also came up in North Carolina. In New England, they were still, although they were always chafing at this, they were still under a royal governor, but they still tended to be very, very independent. And as we move closer toward the move toward independence, you have the New England colonies much more ready. We want to get rid of any European connection whatsoever. We're ready to govern ourselves. And some of the others, Pennsylvania and Virginia and the Carolinas, much slower on that, much less convinced that that was the way to go. So I don't know. I don't know if I properly answered you, but it was a good question. So I guess
Anybody else?
we could have.
No? Well, thank you so much, Richard. It was good. Thank you.
Nice. Very good. Thank you. I need to thank you.